Okay, please go ahead.
Hare Om Jajjagrato Duramodai Te Devan Tado Supatasya Tadhai Vaiti Durangaman Jyoti Khan Jyoti Re Kantan Me Manaha Seva Sankalpamastu Jeha Karmanya Paso Mani Kedo Jagane Kranavante Vedate Kodiraha Jada Purvam Jakshamantaha Prajanantan Me Manaha Shiva Sankalpamastu Hare Om.
तो हिंदी में थोड़ा समरी बता दीजिए
सर। ये यजुर्वेद के एक 34वें अध्याय का एक मंत्र है, शिव संकल्प मंत्र। उसमें का ये चौथा मंत्र है, जिसमें परमात्मा को संबोधित करते हुए मन इंद्रिय के बारे में बताया जा रहा है कि यत् जागृतः दूरम उदित, मतलब जो हमारा मन जागते समय दूर तक चला जाता है और सुप्तावस्था में भी जो मन हमारा दूर तक चला जाता है, वही मन हमारे सभी ज्योतियों की एकमात्र ज्योति है, जो हमारी सभी इंद्रियों को तत्त कार्यों में लगाने के लिए प्रकाशक के रूप में आती है। ऐसे हमारा मन सभी लोगों के लिए शुभ कल्याणकारी से युक्त हो।
बहुत अच्छा, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
जी सर।
And with that, we will begin with our plenary session today. I am delighted to introduce Professor Jeffrey Long of Elizabethtown College. Many of you have seen Professor Long in past Vedanta conferences. A very sincere, committed worker for the cause of Hinduism in this North America, and also a very scholarly person. His latest book, Hinduism in America, has really helped disseminate ideas of Hinduism in North America, and more importantly, how Hinduism can or should find its place in the table of in this marketplace of religious ideas. So starting from his work with students. So Jeffrey, I mean, he will speak about this book primarily, a chapter from his book which talks about political engagement. And I think we need to also bring in Vedanta in a more broad umbrella. Political engagement might seem a little off topic, but no, because it is all in that spirit of how do we place Vedanta in our daily life as well as in this marketplace of ideas and thoughts, etc. And Jeffrey, besides being a scholar, he's also a very sincere sadhaka. In one of his talks, I was very impressed. Just as a matter of a question and answer, he mentioned that since he took his Diksha in 2005, he has not missed a single day of japa and meditation, except for, you know, when you travel. I mean, he frequently travels to Japan. And so when you travel, you know, because of this time zone and this this time difference, sometimes it may happen that you get into a flight and when you land, it is 2 days later. So besides those kinds of things, he has not missed. So with that, Jeffrey, over to you. Do you have slides to share, Jeffrey?
I do.
Okay, so I will give you permission and I will highlight you now.
Screen. Okay. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Professor Sengupta. I'm very grateful for your very kind words. And yeah, in fact, I've come here fresh from my morning meditation. So I'm in a very good frame of mind, I think, to present today. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for that wonderful chanting from the Yajurveda. It was beautifully done, and it just really creates the perfect atmosphere for this kind of conversation. So I will share my screen. And I have some slides here to illustrate my presentation. And what I'm going to do, as Professor Sengupta said, my emphasis here is on Hindu political engagement, which is the topic of the last chapter of my recent book, Hinduism in America, Convergence of Worlds. And you can see the cover there of the book. And what I'm going to do in my presentation, I'm going to start with relatively brief, very quick survey of the history of Hindus in America. The reason I'm doing that is to help create some context for this chapter on political engagement, which is going to be my main focus. And this is because there's a very peculiar dynamic in America between what we might call mainstream American society and the Hindu community. There's been very much of kind of a dual response to the Hindu community in America. On the one hand, there has been acceptance, appreciation, people feeling drawn to Hindu practices, Hindu beliefs. The Vedanta societies have been thriving in this country since Swami Vivekananda established the first one in 1894. On the other hand, there has been very strong, what many of us call Hindu phobia, a mix of racism and religious prejudice that is directed very often against Hindus. And so it's a mixed bag. Right? The mainstream response of Americans to Hinduism is either very positive or very negative. And it's in the navigating of this cultural space that we find the Hindu community becoming more politically engaged and speaking up for the rights of Hindus, and also trying to give a better representation of the Hindu traditions in the US, because a third factor in the reception of Hinduism in America is a profound ignorance about Hinduism. I mean, Hindus have been here, as I'm going to show, for a couple of hundred years. There have been Hindus in America. But in our education system, it's not emphasized very prominently. I'll just give you a quick example. 2 19th century authors who are taught to pretty much all high school students across the US, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, were profoundly influenced by Vedanta and by the Bhagavad Gita in particular. And yet, it's only when students study a course, take a course on Hinduism in America in college, that they learn that fact, right? They read some Emerson, they read some Thoreau in high school, but they're not given any of the context of how these thinkers were, their ideas were shaped by Hindu thought. So there is that dimension as well. You're going to hear me say later that there's been a tremendous influence of Hindu thought on American popular culture. I've given some talks on this, on, for example, Hindu themes in the Star Wars films. Very popular films. And it's all about the Force. Well, the Force, that is basically Brahman, right? That is also, we could say, Shakti. That is the universal, all-pervading divine energy. George Lucas, who created the Star Wars films, got this idea from Joseph Campbell, who studied Vedanta with Swami Nikhilananda at the New York Center back early on in the 20th century. So you have a widely pervasive influence of Hindu ideas, and yet very little knowledge of Hinduism. People don't realize these ideas come from Hindu traditions. And so you have, again, people very strongly drawn to Hindu traditions, people very averse to Hindu traditions, and then a general ignorance about, well, what is Hinduism? And without even realizing that, in the words of another scholar, of Vasudhanarayanan, Americans have long been absorbing ideas from Hinduism without even knowing it. So that's one of the things I was hoping in a small way to help correct with my book, to say, well, no, look, this is the source of many of these ideas. So quick run through of history, and then a sharper focus on contemporary Hindu political engagement is what I'm going to do right now. So if we go all the way back to the 17 and 1800s, the very first Hindus that we know of to have visited America were sailors and workers on British trading ships. This was the period of the British East India Company in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Many of you might have heard of the Boston Tea Party. This was a protest of American revolutionaries against British goods and British taxes. And they dumped tea into the Boston Harbor, and that tea was tea from India, in fact. So there's been an Indian connection with America for a long time. From this early period to the present, as I was just saying, the response of mainstream American society to Indians and to Hindus in particular has been twofold: deep aversion or Hindu phobia, as well as deep attraction and fascination. The first reference to Hinduism by an American author was in a book titled India Christiana by the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, lived from the late 17th to early 18th centuries. To Mather, all Indians, whether we're referring to people from India, right, and to Hindus, or whether we're talking about the Native Americans, who are also referred to as Indians in the US, to Mather, all Indians were simply heathens who needed to be converted to Christianity. He didn't care whether you were a Hindu or whether you were Native American. To him, if you were outside of Christianity, it's all the same, right? So this is an example of that very negative reaction and lack of any kind of serious interest in what Hindus actually believe or practice. In contrast with Mather, however, as the 18th century ended and the 19th began, a growing number of American intellectuals developed a fascination for Hinduism and other non-Western religions. It's not very well known, but the second president of the United States, John Adams, pictured here, was profoundly interested in Hinduism, and whatever books were available in his time on India, he ordered them and had them shipped to his home. And we have a letter in which he writes to Thomas Jefferson about his great excitement that his most recent books on India are on their way. And so I think if you go all the way back to Mather and Adams, you have an embodiment of these two reactions to Hinduism, and the intellectual descendants of both Mather and Adams continue to be active in America today. Adams' interest would pave the way for more in-depth engagement with Hinduism later in the 19th century in the form of movements such as Transcendentalism, that's Emerson and Thoreau, as I mentioned, Theosophy, and New Thought. The first actual Hindu to come and spend a serious amount of time in the United States, the sailors on the ships would come and go, was this woman, Anandibai Joshi. She was the first Hindu to come to the United States as a student. She graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1886. That's just down the road from where I live. During the same period, a Sanskrit scholar, another woman from India, Pandita Ramabai, also came to America. She actually knew Joshi and attended her graduation ceremony in Philadelphia. Joshi and Ramabai were the first of many Hindus who would eventually come to the United States to pursue academic work, right? I see Professor Sengupta, and the tradition continues, right? That we have people who come from India and who are very deeply involved in intellectual life and in the academy. And as you're going to see later, a very large percentage of Hindus in America have advanced degrees and are involved in intellectual activity. Swami Vivekananda, of course, his first welcome address at the World Parliament of Religions, a gathering of religious leaders held in 1893 at what is currently the site of the Museum of the Art Institute of Chicago, created a sensation and put him on the front page of newspapers across the United States. He was quite a renowned figure among mainstream Americans in the 1890s, and he's memorialized even today. On the left, if you see the picture on the left, there is a staircase going into the Art Institute. The building where he spoke is a museum today. And his very famous, really, I think it's almost a kind of sutra, his Sisters and Brothers of America speech. The words are lit up on the steps, and you could read the entire speech there as you go up into the Art Institute. And the section of Michigan Avenue where the Art Institute is located is called, as you can see there, the honorary Swami Vivekananda Way. So a part of the street in Chicago is actually named after Swami Vivekananda. I'm very happy to say that I taught for 3 years at the School of the Art Institute. I taught a course on Indian philosophy. And I used to take my students to the museum once every semester to see the Hindu religious art so they could see depicted the things that we were describing in the course. And the funny thing that happened, I usually had about a dozen students in the course. And as I would show them the Hindu religious art, more people who were just browsing through the museum would come and listen. And by the time I reached the end of the Hindu art section, I usually had about 50 people following and asking questions because there was so much interest in Hinduism. In 1894, Swamiji would establish the first Vedanta Society in New York, and in the decades that followed, the Vedanta societies would become a magnet for intellectuals and artists through whom Hindu thought would eventually come to permeate American popular culture. So I mentioned, for example, Joseph Campbell, Houston Smith, Christopher Isherwood, Aldous Huxley. These are all big names, right? Major intellectuals, literary figures who were drawn to Vedanta, and through their work, Vedantic ideas percolated out into the broader American consciousness. And that's a big part of how many Hindu ideas have become part of mainstream American thought. Again, even though most Americans don't realize that source. Swamiji would be followed by other Hindu teachers such as Paramahansa Yogananda, who came in 1920. Jiddu Krishnamurti also came early on. Then there was a long period from 1924 to 1965 where you did not get new Hindu teachers coming into the Western world. I'm going to explain why that is shortly. This is due to, again, what we today call Hindu phobia. During the same period in which Hindu teachers such as Swami Vivekananda and Paramahansa Yogananda developed widespread and admiring followings, though with some opposition as well, other less-known Hindu teachers and ordinary Indians also came to the U.S. and often faced great difficulties due to a combination of religious bigotry and racism, right? And you see this really very offensive newspaper headline, Hindu hordes invading the state, and so on. And the depiction in the newspaper of what is supposed to be a Hindu is clearly of a Sikh. And Americans, even today, have a difficult time distinguishing between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, right? Because things tend to be viewed through the lens of race. A perception of someone's religious identity often is only skin deep in the US. And so this has also been part of the phenomenon, part of what Hindus have experienced. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Indian men, mostly Sikh, but including some Hindus and Muslims as well, began migrating to the West Coast to work in the logging industry. This occurred mainly in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Known to most Americans as Hindus, or as it was written in those days, Hindus with 2 O's, the religious beliefs and practices of these Indians were poorly understood, with most Americans having little concept of the differences between Hinduism, Sikhism, and Islam. Again, that remains true to the present day. You will probably be horrified to learn that just a few years ago, I had a repairman come to my house and he asked me what I did for a living. I told him about what I said. I teach courses on Hinduism and Buddhism. And he said, oh, the Hindus attacked us on 9/11, right? He said that. And I had to explain to him that Hindus had nothing to do with 9/11. But this is how things are often perceived. There's not much depth of knowledge of these traditions in the US. The Indians back in the early 1900s faced a fierce backlash, which culminated in the Bellingham riots in Bellingham, Washington. This was in 1907. Over 300 Indians were physically assaulted and ended up leaving and going back, in fact, to India. So here's a newspaper headline from that period. Mob raids Hindus and drives them from the city. Shortly after that, getting into the 19 teens and early 20s, we have the Gadar Party. This is a very interesting example of Hindu political engagement in America. Har Dayal, the founder of this party, was an Indian American supporter of the movement for Indian independence from Britain. And he thought, quite logically, but unfortunately naively, that the US and India would be natural allies as both had been British colonies. During World War I, however, Britain was an ally of the US, and his Gadar party fell under the suspicion of the US government. He was arrested and eventually fled to Germany and finally made his way back to India. So even though the US had been a colony of Britain, there was a feeling of greater solidarity with the British, who were also white, than with people of Indian origin and Indian descent, who, even though they were facing the same struggle. Har Dayal eventually ended up joining Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent movement for Indian independence. But you can see the kind of resistance that he faced shows the depth of the prejudice that one can find against Hindus in America. Really, the height of this prejudice is represented by this organization called the Asiatic Exclusion League. The racism and bigotry of this era was not directed exclusively at Indians. People from other parts of Asia, such as China and Japan, also living on the West Coast, also experienced this prejudice. An organization called the Asiatic Exclusion League was formed in 1908, aimed at expelling all Asians, Indian, Chinese, and Japanese, from the US. The efforts of this organization culminated in 1924 with the passage by the US Congress of the Asian Exclusion Act. And this is why we don't have gurus coming between 1924 and 1965. Except for a few academics, Indians generally were not allowed into the US during this period. The act would not be lifted until 1965. One individual I want to point to, because sometimes individual stories bring these things to life more than broad general discussion. In 1913, A.K. Majumdar, a Hindu teacher who proclaimed in his work the harmony of Hinduism and Christianity, he thought very much along the lines of Ramohan Roy from a century earlier. He was the first Indian to become a United States citizen. In 1923, in the case that would lead to the Asian Exclusion Act, he became the first Indian American to have his U.S. citizenship revoked, taken away from him. His citizenship was taken from him, and he had to go back to India. So this brings us now to the contemporary situation. In 1965, the Asian Exclusion Act was lifted as a direct consequence of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was, of course, an outcome of the activism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was deeply influenced by the thought of Mahatma Gandhi. So through the movement for civil rights for African Americans, the door was actually open for greater civil rights for all Americans. And the US Congress realized that the racial quotas that they had in place for immigration really had no place any longer once the Civil Rights Act was passed. So the Asian Exclusion Act was lifted in 1965. And then we get larger numbers of people, larger numbers of Hindus coming from India and from other parts of the world. The photo here, by the way, is of one of 6 Hindu temples located in Pittsburgh, in the state of Pennsylvania, where I live. I'm not in Pittsburgh. My wife's cousin lives in Pittsburgh, but there are several Hindu temples there, and this is one of them. So it's probably not that common of a scene in India to see a Hindu temple surrounded by snow, but here you see it in America. With the lifting of the Asian Exclusion Act, Hindus began to migrate to the US in ever greater numbers, establishing temple communities throughout the country. And in the 1970s, you get the first Hindu temple communities really sort of starting to expand and flourish across the US. Now, just about every major US city has a Hindu temple. And in the appendix of my book, I have a list of all the Hindu temples in the US that I was able to find either through the internet or through my own research and experience. And I expect that that list is also not complete because new temples are being established all the time. Today, Hindus are one of the most materially successful religious groups in the United States, with the highest levels of educational achievement and among the highest household incomes of any religious group. The source for most of my data in terms of statistics in my book is either the Pew or Gallup polls. And Pew especially is really good on religious polling. In the United States Census, there are no questions about religion. Religion is seen as a private matter. There's separation of church and state. And so the government doesn't collect data on religion. But private polling organizations will ask people questions and will come up with some really good data on religion. And one of the polls that Pew does every year, it has to do with educational achievement and also financial achievement among religious groups. And Hindus are consistently the highest group in terms of education. 48% of Hindu Americans hold a postgraduate degree, so almost half. And I would say much more than that, maybe not 100%, but probably close to 100% hold at least a college degree. So Hindus who've come to America are largely very educated people in fields like engineering, fields like medicine, the sciences. This is a place where Hindus have just excelled tremendously in the United States. In terms of income, every year the data comes out and the Hindu community is either first or second most years in terms of income. The other community with whom it vies for first place is the Jewish community in the US. So those two communities tend to be affluent. So Hindus have been successful in the United States, and this is part of the story. I think this forms part of the narrative I'm about to tell about Hindu political engagement in the US. There are roughly 3 million Hindus in the US today, slightly less than 3 million, or approximately 0.7%, 0.7% of the total population. So not quite 1% of Americans are Hindus. Though, as I discuss in my book, there is a wider penumbra, you could say, of people who do not identify as Hindu, but who may be part of an organization that was established by a Hindu guru, people who practice transcendental meditation, people in the tradition that I'm part of, the Vedanta Society, people in self-realization fellowship, Siddha Yoga, ISKCON. We have a whole variety of Hindu-based traditions. And some of the followers of those traditions define themselves as Hindu and some do not. So if we include all of those people, who maybe don't call themselves Hindu, but who practice meditation, believe in rebirth, are often vegetarian, maybe have some murtis of Hindu deities in the home. The number may be more than 3 million, and maybe more than 1%. So you have the self-identified Hindu community, and then you have this wider following of Hindu ideas. Hindus are an increasingly diverse community. Among those who do identify as Hindu, overwhelmingly, we have people of Indian origin or other Asian countries with Hindu populations. So people from Nepal, Bhutan. We have a fairly large Bhutanese refugee community in this area. There's also a Nepali community, and as well as lots of people, of course, from India. So 91%, that's most of the Hindu community in America. But we have 2% who define themselves as mixed. Many, though not all, of these people have one Indian parent. 4% are white, 2% are African American, and 1% are Hispanic or Latino. And in fact, there have been leaders in the Hindu traditions in the US drawn from all of these ethnic groups. They're, of course, from the white ethnic background. You probably have heard of the Swamis who run the journal Hinduism Today. They're from the Shaiva Siddhanta tradition. In our Vedanta Society, we have lots of Swamis who are of European heritage or Jewish heritage very often. In the African American community, in ISKCON, there are a couple of major leaders who have come from the African American community, and I know of one Hispanic Hindu teacher as well. So people from outside of the Indian ethnic origin have been accepted in the community, not only as members, but even taking leadership positions sometimes. So this shows you the depth of interest that at least some segment of Americans has in Hinduism. The earlier generations of Hindus in America were hesitant to become involved in politics. From 1965 until the late 90s, I think it's safe to say, most Hindus in America were concerned that controversies would have a negative effect on their well-being. They're an immigrant community. They're trying to assimilate to American culture, to be accepted. So in that situation, you don't want to do things that are going to make people angry or draw unwelcome attention to you. So one finds very little or no Hindu political engagement in the first decades since the lifting of the Asian Exclusion Act. And of course, if you think of the earlier experience, the earlier 20th century that led to the Asian Exclusion Act, the fears were quite justified, right? That any kind of controversy associated with Hinduism could have a very negative effect on the community. This has begun to change. The younger generation of Hindu Americans, Hindus who've grown up in the US, we have second and even third generation Indian American Hindus whose home is America, right? They were born here, they grew up here. Some of them have never been to India, or they've been to India on childhood trips. They have become more politically engaged, speaking up for their own rights and the rights of others, and seeking to correct misconceptions about Hindu traditions. I don't have a slide about it, but I'm looking at my book right now. And in fact, the very first, as far as we can tell, real political response of Hindus in America was in actually 1997. There was a group that was formed called American Hindus Against Defamation. And there were a number of incidents where Hindus felt targeted. And the most notorious of these was when the Southern Baptist Convention, which is one of the largest Christian churches in the US, actually created a special pamphlet about how to convert Hindus to Christianity. And to add insult to injury, they released it on Diwali back in the late 90s. And they were really making a strong effort to try to convert Hindus to Christianity. By the way, this is one of the main manifestations of Hindu phobia in the US. You have very frequently, if you talk to any group of Hindus in America, if you raise this topic, has anyone ever tried to convert you? Has anyone ever approached you about accepting Jesus and becoming Christian? The stories will start to pour out. And sometimes these approaches come in a very friendly guise. People say, oh, come join our church. We have a nice, dinner afterward, and you can hang out and get to know people. And then sometimes it's very aggressive. I edited back in 2007 a report by the Hindu American Foundation on hate speech against Hindus. And there are a lot of evangelical Christian websites saying really horrible things, really false and defamatory things about Hindu traditions, and very strange kind of theological claims coming from a Christian perspective, Hindus worshiping the devil and that sort of thing. And as recently as this year, there was a legal case in Alabama where over the teaching of yoga in schools to children. And there were people who were very opposed to this because they believed that if you practice yoga, practice meditation, you would become possessed by the devil or something like that. And I've had these encounters. In fact, I had a very unpleasant one fairly recently. I'm not very active on Twitter, but I tweeted about it because there's been this conversation about Hindu phobia going on in the community. And I thought it was important to point out that it is a real phenomenon. There are people who want to say, there's really no Hindu phobia. No, there's definitely Hindu phobia. I've encountered it personally. I know people who've encountered it personally. And it is a real phenomenon in the US. Not typically manifesting as things like physical violence, but there has actually even been that as well. So because of these experiences, the younger generation of Hindu Americans who don't see themselves as immigrants, they see themselves as Americans, and they say, why do we have to put up with this? Why do we have to deal with this kind of abuse when other Americans don't? We refuse this. So this first sort of step of American Hindus Against Defamation was taken in the late 90s. Then when we get into the 2000s, we come to the Hindu American Foundation, established in 2003. This is the organization that's really played the most prominent role in advocacy work for the Hindu community in America. And I think I need to give a couple of disclaimers as well. I am not here as a spokesperson for the Hindu American Foundation, and I will talk about it enough that you might begin to think, wait, this guy's from HAF, right? Because I have actually had a lot of connections with HAF. I am currently a member of HAF's Academic Advisory Council, but that's not a paid position. This is all seva. This is all volunteer work. But I believe in the work of HAF, and I have been involved with them. I mentioned the editing of the report on hate speech. That was my first involvement with HAF back in 2007. I've spoken at their fundraisers at various times, but I'm not an employee of HAF, and I'm not here to represent them. But the reason I'm emphasizing them a lot is because it's simply because it is the case that they have really been at the center of Hindu political engagement. If you look at any Hindu activism in the US, you're going to find HAF mentioned somewhere in that context. They really have been a very prominent voice. And they occupy, I think, an interesting position, which I'm going to talk about a little more later. Another reason I talk about HAF a lot, and I emphasize it a lot in the chapter of my book, is because given my proximity to the group, they've been available to me for interviews, to ask questions, to understand what they're all about, how they understand their activism, and so on. So I think I'm able to speak with some authority about the perspectives of HAF and the stances they take. So they've been very prominent in this work. This work has included high school and middle school textbook reform to correct misrepresentations of Hinduism and advocating for Hindus whose civil rights have been violated in the US. I mentioned before that we have separation of religion and government, separation of church and state, as it's called in the US. And the government is not supposed to take a stand on religious issues. It's not supposed to promote any one religion. We don't have a state religion in America. People will often call America a Christian nation. There are a lot of Christians here. Christianity deeply informs the culture. There would be no arguing that point. But legally, people who practice Hinduism have all the same rights as Christians, as members of any other religion, or people who have no religion. We pay the same taxes. Our passports work the same. We vote. So there is no legal endorsement of any one religion. However, one does find Christian politicians sometimes trying to promote Christianity in ways that cross the line, trying to push Christianity in various ways, usually on the state level. This is not usually happening on the federal level. It's usually happening on the local level. And HAF is right there to file a case and to push back against those kinds of things. In that way, the natural ally of HAF in a lot of these struggles has been the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is, again, all about freedom of speech and separation of church and state. So this has been a big part of HAF's activity. And in terms of the school textbook, textbooks, that's also been very important, because this is how most Americans form their views of Hinduism. They take a class in school, and at one time, all that you would read in those textbooks would be about things like sati, which of course was banned in the 1800s, casteism, this is really heavily emphasized, very little about Vedanta philosophy, about Brahman, about Atman, about the Upanishads, moksha, those things. No, it's all the things that appear exotic to Americans that are emphasized. And it's interesting, a lot of the same ideas that the Hindu tradition teaches are found in Buddhism, and Buddhism tends to be represented very positively, though there's a strong pushback against Buddhism from many Christians. But the ideals of the Dharma traditions tend to get more associated in people's minds here with Buddhism, and Hinduism gets associated with all the exotic stuff. And this is something HAF has really worked hard to correct. The work of HAF has drawn plenty of controversy, with the organization sometimes being accused of supporting Hindu nationalist parties and movements in India. This is a recent occurrence where HAF gets accused of being almost something like a front organization for what is presented in some quarters as some kind of Hindu takeover of the world. And this is, I personally think it's an absurd claim, and I'm going to explain why in a little bit. My experiences with HAF are quite contrary to that picture of HAF. Recently, in fact, HAF has taken legal action against organizations and individuals who've made these and other kinds of accusations. This case is still in progress. It's before the courts, so it's not something, well, I'm not privy to it in any case, but even if I was, I couldn't speak much about it. But that is a very bold move. It's because if you take something to court, you're basically saying the truth is on my side, and you're confident enough in what you're doing to take it before the court. So these actions are occurring right now. HAF, though, is not alone. And it's important to point out that Hindu Americans are as politically diverse and divided as any other group of Americans. The US, as probably all of you know, is very politically polarized right now. And you can find Hindus across the political spectrum. Now, traditionally, Hindus have tended to gravitate more to the Democratic Party. That's still the case today. The Democratic Party has been more often at the forefront of issues like immigration and civil rights for minorities and so on. So there's a logical affinity, I think, between Hindus as a largely immigrant community and the Democratic Party. But we'll find there are interesting exceptions to that as well. This ideological diversity is reflected in the range of Hindu American organizations that exist. There are many Hindu American organizations. Some are very small. Some are just a website. Frankly, if you dig a little deeper, you find that there's not much there. Whereas others are very robust organizations that have been around for a long time. On what we might call the right, we have VHPA, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America. This was established in 1970, right? So way back, right after Hindus started coming back into the United States in larger numbers. When I say political right, I don't mean in terms of American politics, because VHPA has not really involved itself in things like American electoral politics, but it's closely tied to the Vishwa Hindu Parishad in India. It's part of the global Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and that is generally seen as a conservative Hindu organization. So that's why I would place it in there. Same with HSS, Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh. This was incorporated in the US in 1989. HSS was actually started in Kenya way back in I think it was in the 50s, but its American branch was established in 1989. I actually spoke at an HSS event a number of years ago. This was in commemoration of the 125th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda, and they had what they called a Dharma and Yoga festival, near Westchester in Pennsylvania. And I spoke at that. I spoke on Swami Vivekananda. So I have some acquaintance with HSS. I had a very nice time at that event. It's interesting. Sometimes you hear these groups demonized in the U.S. There's a Hindu nationalist group and so on, and the picture you get in your mind is of something sort of very aggressive. And I thought, I accepted the invitation, and I thought, but well, what will it be like when I go? And oh my goodness, there were children running around everywhere, and I think about a dozen people offered me tea at different times. And it was like a big family event. It was like something that would happen at my local temple. And I thought, that this is this organization seemed to me really to mainly be about promoting a good understanding of Hinduism. And in fact, with VHPA and HSS, they're both connected with their parent organizations in India, the VHP and RSS, respectively. But in America, they're not really involved in American politics. They're involved in raising the visibility of Hinduism in America, such as, for example, promoting Hindu Heritage Month. A number of states, including, I'm happy to say, my state of Pennsylvania, have declared October Hindu Heritage Month. October, I think, makes sense. We have Dussehra and Durga Puja, Navratri during this time. Diwali is shortly to come. So it's been declared a Hindu Heritage Month. So this is more the kind of thing you see VHPA and HSS doing. And I think this makes sense. I think this is consistent with the model of, the earlier Hindu advocacy not really getting involved in controversial political issues, but really more just trying to make a home for Hinduism in the US. On the other end of the political spectrum, we have the Sadhana Coalition and Hindus for Human Rights. These are relatively recent organizations. They formed within the last decade or so. They're quite outspoken about issues in India, in fact. This is, again, a relatively new phenomenon, but these groups are emerging now as part of Hindu American political engagement. On the spectrum of right to left, I would say HAF could be considered to occupy the middle, despite frequent accusations and assertions that it is a right-wing organization. Again, I think the claim that it is a right-wing organization is very problematic. Hindu American Foundation issued a statement, actually a fairly extensive document, a study that was extremely critical of casteism and caste prejudice in India, really not different from what you see from Sadhana or Hindus for Human Rights. So HAF was there even before those organizations saying, you know, casteism is wrong, caste prejudice has no place in an authentic Hindu understanding. And then more recently, they published a similar study on LGBTQ issues and homosexuality, and saying, again, arguing that on the basis of Hindu Shastras, there's no foundation for prejudice against people based on sexual orientation. There are accounts in scripture of people with different sexual orientation, different genders beyond the binary genders. And in fact, HAF will even assist gay couples who want to have a Hindu wedding. They'll connect them with priests who are willing to do that. I would not call this right-wing activity. This is in fact seen as very much coming from the left, at least in the American political spectrum. So at the same time, HAF has supported some of the moves of the current government in India. And so that would be something seen as more coming from the right. And so I think because it's kind of both, I'd say you would put Hindu American Foundation in the middle. I would see it as a moderate, politically moderate organization. They've been supportive of both Democratic and Republican politicians, if those politicians have been favorable to Hinduism and to the Hindu community. I mean, just for an example, I mentioned Hindu Heritage Month. The governor of Pennsylvania, my governor, Tom Wolf, is a Democrat, and he declared Pennsylvania to have Hindu Heritage Month. But Governor Greg Abbott in Texas, who's a pretty hardcore Republican, also declared Hindu Heritage Month in Texas. So Hindu traditions and Hinduism seems to be a bipartisan issue in America, and HAF sort of straddles that divide. In 2012, the first Hindu was elected to Congress. I'm sure many of you have heard of Tulsi Gabbard, a Democrat from Hawaii, Gulf War veteran. She was raised Hindu, though she's actually not of Indian descent. Her parents were drawn to Vaishnava tradition, and she grew up with that. She ran for president in 2020. I'm sure many of you are aware of her candidacy. Unsuccessful ultimately. Here, my wife and I are flanking Tulsi Gabbard. We met her at an event in DC, an HAF event actually in 2018. So I've met Tulsi Gabbard. In 2016, 3 more Hindu Americans were elected to Congress. We have Ro Khanna, Democrat from California, Raja Krishnamurthy, Democrat from Illinois, who also spoke at that 2018 event, and Pramila Jayapal, Democrat from Washington, who has a very prominent role in our Congress. She's head of the House Progressive Caucus in Congress. So you see Hindus, again, being more weighted in the direction of the Democratic Party. All 3 of these more recent Hindu Americans in Congress were reelected. They're all still in Congress in 2020. Though Tulsi Gabbard, after her unsuccessful run for the Democratic nomination for president, opted not to run for reelection for her seat in Congress. The mother of our vice president, Kamala Harris, was a Hindu immigrant from India. Kamala Harris does not herself identify as Hindu, right? We don't have a Hindu vice president, but it's interesting that the daughter of a Hindu immigrant has risen to such a high level in the United States. So this shows you that even though there's still religious bigotry, there's still racial bigotry, nevertheless, there's also that other side of America that is accepting, that is open, and in which someone like Kamala Harris could rise to the position that she has. While, again, most of the Hindu political activity has been on the side of the Democratic Party, there's a pretty vocal group on the other side. We couldn't mention Hindu engagement in America without mentioning Hindus for Trump. Although the Hindu-American involvement in electoral politics is quite strongly on the side of the Democratic Party, there's a Hindu-American voice on the political right as well. And yeah, the Hindus for Trump were, they were very, very vocal in the most recent election. Whatever one may think, whatever one's political views, Democratic, Republican, right or left, like Trump, don't like Trump, Hindus fall in all of these categories. And I think that speaks to the diversity of the Hindu tradition. And I think it also speaks to what I would call the maturing of the Hindu community in America, in the sense that, we now have a community that feels confident enough in itself to be able to support a variety of different political perspectives and to engage in a very vigorous debate. If you get all involved on Hindu activity on social media, I mean, you'll see all kinds of, again, very vigorous debate. Sometimes it's uncivil, but that's true of a lot of American political debate generally. But yes, this is the environment now that you see of Hindu political engagement in America. Where is all of this going to lead? The ongoing struggle for Hindu Americans is to find acceptance in American society, while at the same time remaining true to Hindu values and a Hindu worldview and way of life. There is acceptance, but assimilation can be a problematic idea if it means leaving your values and leaving your identity at the door. What do you keep and retain, and what do you what is not appropriate in America, right? This is something that Hindus, I think, are increasingly figuring out. It requires the mainstream of American society to overcome the racism and religious bigotry that has plagued its relationship with Hindu Americans in the past, and to build on and recognize the ways in which Hindu thought has already profoundly influenced American culture. There's every reason to hope that this will eventually occur. I think it's already occurring, but there's also every reason to expect it to involve some amount of struggle and hardship and to continue to take time. There's still a lot of issues that need to be worked out. There are still areas where Hindus face prejudice, and with the increasing political diversity of the Hindu community in America, there's also divisiveness within the Hindu community, and that is also an issue that needs to be overcome. I mentioned some of the Hindu organizations, Hindus for Human Rights, for example. They're one of the organizations that's actually being sued by Hindu American Foundation, right? So you have one Hindu organization suing another Hindu organization for allegations of that were made by that other organization. So again, without taking a side on any of that, but just presenting it as it is, we can say that disagreement is a normal thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Divisiveness and polarization can be destructive for a community, though. So this, you could say, is an internal enemy. Not any one perspective is an enemy, but that the divisiveness itself is something that needs to be overcome. Ways of talking about these things that don't involve, excessive, name calling and attacks and so on. But then again, American society as a whole has not learned that lesson. But maybe the Hindu community could show the way for us at some point. So those are just some preliminary reflections. There's much, much more that could be said about this topic, but I'm going to stop now and give time for, I think Professor Sengupta might have some questions for me. So I yield the floor.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for this wonderful history of Hinduism in America, starting from those who came on British ships. And for those of you who are joining from India, don't ever think that this is exclusively for the people who live in North America, because it's a globalized world. What affects India in terms of thought and action, political action, affects here as well as vice versa. And then there is this whole Hindu community in the diaspora who look to the United States for guidance and as to how they will navigate their own culture. So it's a global audience that we need to keep in mind. And I mean, Jeffrey, in this plenary talks, we do not have a Q&A session, but I'm I will nevertheless ask you just one question. And this is something that has grappled me for a long, long time. And you also alluded to it. Buddhism seems to be in much more favor. And you said there is some pushback. I don't know much about it. But in general, why do you think there is this kind of, whatever you may call it, this dissonance that Buddhism, much more positive, but when it comes to Hinduism, we kind of are burdened with all these caricatures that you talked about.
Yes, this is something I've given a great deal of thought to as well. In fact, it's affected my teaching. I used to have two separate courses, one on Hinduism, one on Buddhism. And I found that the students who were sincere spiritual seekers and really earnest seekers for truth, they always took the Buddhism course. And the Hinduism course was filled with people who just had to fulfill their non-Western culture requirement, and they weren't really that interested in the beginning, though they became interested as they took the course. And I realized that saw the stereotypes and the way the two traditions are seen differently by Americans. So I combined the two into one course on Dharma traditions. And now I find the students have a much more integrated understanding of these things. So why is that? I think there's a very specific history behind this. If we go back to the 19th century, to the first Indologists, the Europeans who were studying India and Indian traditions, most of them were Protestant Christians. And the way they read ancient Indian history, they saw the Vedic tradition as being analogous to the Catholic Church, full of priests and ritual and, as they would say, superstition. And they saw the Buddha as a kind of Protestant reformer, something like a Martin Luther, who got rid of all the ritual and was just about, the philosophy. And of course, there's been a growing atheist movement in the West also since the last couple hundred years. And because Buddhism is not theistic, at least in a conventional sort of Western sense, it's seen as something more rational, right? More accessible to the scientific mind. So with that idea that Buddhism is this kind of Protestant scientific rational tradition, it gets that positive boost. And then all of the negativity that the Protestant writers projected onto Catholicism, they projected onto Hinduism. And they saw Hinduism as Catholicism run wild, right? And they saw India as what Europe would have been if there had been no Protestant Reformation, right? So there's actually anti-Catholicism, I think, embedded in this anti-Hindu movement. That's not to say that, there have also been Catholic writers who've been very anti-Hindu. Paul Hawker is a great example. He coined the term Neo-Vedanta, which we all have kind of struggled with at different times. But yes, I think from a very early period, Buddhism was looked upon positively, and that has continued to be the case. So it's very common to find scholars of Buddhism who also practice Buddhism, and that's readily accepted in the academy because, well, Buddhism is sort of this very rational thing. But if you actually participate in the ritual life of traditional forms of Buddhism, and if you go to a Tibetan Buddhist ceremony, it's very much like a Hindu ceremony. It's as colorful. You have deities, you have all of these things. And so, the sort of tantric side of Buddhism is very much like Hinduism. There is a Buddhist ritual, there are Buddhist deities, and all of this has been downplayed. And, I once actually got into an argument with a student who was saying, there are no Buddhist deities. I said, I can name you Buddhist deities, and I've been to their temples in Japan, in India, these exist. And so those stereotypes are things we're still trying to overcome. But yeah, I think Buddhism has done a wonderful job in terms of PR, you could say, in the West. And I think there are also good lessons there for the Hindu community. One of the things I would like to see us do a little more of, I think Swami Sarvapriyananda at the New York Vedanta Society does a wonderful job of this, showing how there are connections between Vedanta and scientific understandings. There are insights that are being now confirmed, things like quantum theory and so on, that have really very interesting precedents in Vedanta. the conversation on the nature of consciousness, which is really preoccupying more and more physicists, neuroscientists. I mean, the Dalai Lama has weighed in on this, right? He attends the event at Harvard each year where they, talk about these things. And I think we should be as involved in that. And in 2019, I published an edited volume on rebirth, on reincarnation, as it's called in the West. And there's some very interesting work going on the cutting edge of science on past life memory, for example, in small children. So one of the things that I find will make people in America more open-minded toward a tradition is if they see it as scientific, right? If they see that it's not asking them to believe in something that is irrational. And you have a lot of people who are disenchanted with Christianity, but they also are not atheists. They want a spiritual life. So for them, either Buddhism or Vedanta will be very attractive. I have a good friend in the Vedanta Society who says, and I like to quote her, she says about herself, "I'm too scientific for most religious people and too religious for most scientific people." That's a Pravajika Gayatri Prana. I'm sure you've met her.
Yes, yes.
And I think that there's that group of Americans that rejects all religion. There's a group of Americans that are Christian fundamentalists of various kinds. And then you have this group of people who are, like I said, us kind of scientific, kind of spiritual types. And there, I think, is a place where Hinduism can be really appreciated.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And I know you have to go to a class. And so those of you who have been joining us since Saturday, you remember yesterday Subhash Kak also was saying the same thing, that we have to be at the high table of scientific thought and scientific ideas. And Subhash yesterday, he gave a wonderful exposition of how some of these core concepts in quantum mechanics or AI did have Indian influences. So thank you so much, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again.
Thank you. And thank you for mentioning Subhashji. He's a good friend of mine. I have a lot of respect for him. And when you said that he was saying the same thing, I felt very good. So thank you.
Wonderful. So with that, we are ready to move to session 6 of this conference. This is on Vedanta.